since we've recently applied to grad schools, and I personally remember how confused I was when I applied, just didn't know the process. And looking back, the process after figuring out is less intimidating than it was before figuring it out. Thought it would be cool to run a workshop like this, and probably one of the most helpful things we could possibly do, as a up and coming not-for-profit organization, supporting quantum science and quantum computing education and open sourcing it. So I guess a quick pitch, our Discord server link was above. And so any questions we don't get to today and that can be asked live during Google Meet chat, you can also ask in the Ask Anything channel of our Discord server. Noting that our Discord server has an About page. So that About channel, you just have to type in !accept. So that's a specific command. I'll explain in the About channel, but that's just to prevent, that's just to prevent people, prevent bots from getting in, actually. People are fine. So yeah, this is our website. So we got a nonprofit grant from the Unitary Fund. They're a nonprofit that supports open source quantum education and quantum computing software initiatives. And so we're using the grant money to give a free t-shirt with we have an ongoing t-shirt competition, t-shirt design competition until the end of August. And the winning design or some combination of designs, some variant of it will be on the t-shirts that are going to be free for anyone who contributes, meaning not contributes money, but contributes a new educational material. So this could be writing an article, recording a video, drawing a comic, adding text next to slides to be a standalone resource, or presenting a slide as a video, creating a board or card or video game, open sourcing their lecture notes with permission of the course, explaining a programming project, research on professional aspects of being a quantum researcher. So just showing that there's many different ways to kind of just I guess give back to the community. And yeah, it's pretty much all it's volunteer run. So that's just who we are and what we've been doing. We started off less than a month ago. It's less than a month ago, I think. So we've gone pretty far since. Alvaro and Sam didn't put their photos here, but they're here. So a bit about us, we'll introduce yourselves. And here's a question at the bottom on the slide. So it's questions that we got in advance we put on the slide, so we'll probably cover them.
By the way, for those who are watching, if you have any more questions and whenever you get them or would like to ask them, just put them in the chat and we will address those questions as soon as we get to the relevant part of the slide. And any questions that we miss, we will be answering them on the Discord channel. Yeah, thanks a lot. Leah, would you like to maybe start by introducing yourself?
Wasn't sure. Hi, my name's Leah, and I just graduated double major in computing and physics at UC Santa Barbara. That's in California in the US. And I'm starting a computer science PhD at the University of Oxford, researching quantum computer architecture and quantum compilation this fall. And I think we also we'll cover how we switched fields in this presentation. So I grew up in the US, and I applied and I was accepted at grad programs in the US, Canada, and the UK. Just whoever wants to go next.
Okay, so do you want to say something about your bachelor's research, or maybe later on when you say how you switch fields?
Yeah, we're doing switching fields in the next slide.
Okay, so I'm Bavitra. I am originally from Colombo, Sri Lanka, where I was born and grown up. But then I moved to Germany to do my bachelor's in physics, in which I specialize in experimental particle physics. And now currently I am doing my master's in physics and quantum technology and theoretical condensed matter physics and quantum information science at WTA Chapter.
Right, I guess I'll go next. Hi everyone, I'm Samanvir. I'm from India, and I also did my bachelor's in computer science from India. Starting this fall, I will be joining KU University as a master's student in cyber informatics and doing research in quantum computing and quantum information.
Okay, it's my turn. Yeah. Well, hello everyone. I'm Alberto. I'm Mexican and I studied my master's degree. Well, before I studied my bachelor in computer science. My master's degree is studied in Mexico, and well, it's computer science, but actually this is about quantum algorithm try to in the field in the image processing.
Yeah, so that's all about us, the TLDR. And to answer the question at the bottom here at the slide from that we got in advance, so we'll just go around and I'll answer that. My undergrad did have professors working on quantum computing, but I didn't do any research with those professors at my university. Like for example, one of the professors solely took on grad students for research. Had never taken on undergrads as far as I knew. How I worked on an official project was through a summer research program. So I applied for that research program without having had research experience in the field of quantum computing, but I had a few years to show of courses that I'd taken of just that, like being a hobbyist in it for the 2 years. So that gave my application a bit more weight.
So should I go next or?
Yeah, just anytime.
So my bachelor's, like I said, was primarily in particle physics, in which I did my thesis and research and things like proton beam therapy for cancer and then Higgs boson decay analysis for CERN. But then one day I just decided the particle physics field is quite too old, and then like overnight I decided to switch my specialization into a different university. And now currently I am in my first semester of my master's, and I'm working on my master thesis project in quantum simulation using variational quantum eigensolver for quantum chemistry applications at the German Aerospace Center. So I'm also quite new to this field, and now only I'm starting to find out which universities are actually doing courses on this and research on this. So I hope what I found out during those few months would be useful to everyone here.
Alberto, would you like to go next?
Yes. Okay. Well, it's my turn, right? Yeah. Okay. Actually, I don't have any idea about when I studied my master's degree, I tried to work in another area towards artificial intelligence, machine learning, and try to create about different algorithms. But well, I met my advisor, so I tried to understand more about the fixed area or quantum fixed area, and I try motivate to change my thesis about to the quantum algorithms. And well, since 2 years ago, I learned more of the quantum computing.
All right, I guess I'll go next. So in my case, I was working on projects based in machine learning and Internet of Things back in my bachelor's, and I was quite unsure of like what direction to specifically take. But I did have I had taken classes in physics-based courses, including quantum mechanics at college. And even since high school, I was like really enthusiastic about physics. So when the opportunity presented in the form of quantum computing, and when I first learned about the field, I was really, I was really excited about it. And so after graduating in 2019, I took a year off. I did a lot of open source projects. I I also happen to work with fellow enthusiasts to form a community of quantum computing interested people in India. And so, yeah, a short plug there. And yeah, so we currently work on a lot of community initiatives, and just working on community and open source projects really helped me learn a lot about quantum computing. So, and in the meanwhile, I was also applying to grad school with very specific focus research labs and fields. And so, yeah, when I got the opportunity, I signed up, and yeah, that's kind of how I got into a grad opportunity in quantum computing.
Yeah, so that's the four of us. So the roadmap of this workshop is we will talk about the 8 sections, well, the 7 sections that are on this slide, plus at the end, whatever time we'll have questions and answers. So we'll try to have for around 10 to 15 minutes per section, and whatever we don't cover, we can come back to, both in this workshop or in our Ask Anything channel of our Discord server. And so our goal for running this workshop, as I said before, is just to share about the challenges and unknowns of applying, because in addition to the official application project, which by the way is official application process, which is different to every program, to every country, there's that you can see on their webpage. There's also a few unofficial asides to how to apply, and once you get the complete picture, it becomes a lot easier to apply. So we just wanted to make that process more accessible for people to understand and go through. So different countries and programs and fields will have different timelines. So we won't give the timelines for every single country, but what we will give is our personal timelines to get the idea of what that might look like. And hopefully by the end of this workshop, you'll have more knowledge and confidence about the process. So the four of us have successfully applied to master's and PhD programs in computer science, physics, and ECE in the US, Canada, UK, Japan, Mexico, and Germany, if I'm remembering right. Yeah, that's right. We'll do this in a kind of informal panel discussion, so it's natural to ask questions, and we'll cover all the topics that we want to cover. We won't all answer every bullet point or every question, but this will definitely give a good overview of it. So to start,
Also, I'll just give a quick shout out. There's a lot of people joining from what I see: California, Mexico, India, and thanks again for joining us today. We hope that this panel discussion helps you just strengthen your application a little bit more. And if you're uncertain about where or how to apply, that helps you just gain a little more confidence. So thanks again for joining.
Let's start with the first section. So the first section is called What is Grad School, just to cover what it is. So there's differences between a master's and a PhD program, and also the language used to describe that. So for example, in what I've heard is that in the US, the masters and PhDs are both called graduate programs, and in the UK and India, they're called, so master's is called a graduate program, and then a PhD is called a postgraduate. So that's a difference in language. And also the difference in language kind of makes sense because in the US and Canada, it's typical to do a longer PhD, and in STEM, it's often the case where undergraduates go directly into PhD because the PhD is longer, and the first 2 years of the PhD is pretty much equivalent to master's coursework. And unofficially, if you were to leave the PhD halfway through or even before that, if you'd completed those coursework, you could drop out with a master's. This is what is pretty common happening. Whereas in Europe and the UK, what happens is it's usually required to have a master's before you can apply for the PhD, and the PhD is also shorter because it's split up into that distinction. So that's for any clarification. The rest of this talk will, yeah. So that's a difference. And there's also differences in Europe between a taught master's and a research master's. The difference is exactly what it sounds like. Top masters are usually coursework, and research masters have this more emphasis on the research portion of it. I think that distinction also exists in the US. If you're ever unsure about any of these definitions or regional differences, don't hesitate to ask the program officers of any program you're applying to. They're usually pretty good at responding and just can answer any of those questions. Some pros and cons of applying to grad school. I think it's common consensus that for almost all fields, it's not a good economic investment compared to like working in industry for most fields in the short term. And then pros is that you get to like possibly have more independence in your daily like work. You might be able to have more flexible work schedules depending on the field. By independence, I mean instead of working towards getting an end product, which is what most positions in industry are working towards, you can explore some of the like ideas or questions, or just kind of go deeper into a specific topic and develop like skills that you can walk away with. Some cons. By the way, these are off the top of my head, but you can also look these up. Some cons. Another pros is that graduate school can be a lot more affordable than undergrad. So you might be able to get funding for master's programs, and for PhD programs, most of them are fully funded. So in the US, 94% of people from age 21 to 30 have a major funding source for their PhD. So this is in STEM. So in the US and Canada, this is true. And some cons is that there's the PhD can be quite challenging. So I think the 8-year graduation rate for a PhD or 10-year graduation rate for a PhD is around 57%. The reason the percentage is much higher this is in the US and Canada, the percentage is much higher for international students, and the reason why the percentage is a lot lower than you would expect, I guess, in the US and Canada is mainly, as I said before, the economic incentive and the fact that you can, in many cases, unofficially drop out with the master's. There's some language differences possibly between TAing and RAing. So this is not RA as in like your dorms, if you've been in dorms with an RA, but this is the difference between a teaching assistantship and a research assistantship. So this is just in addition to like what kind of program you're in, where your primary funding source, which funding sources you have. So a teaching assistantship would be an agreement to teach a certain number of hours a week, or do some grading, do some like helping out the instructor with sections, even possibly teach a course. So those are teaching obligations by the departments, and they're pretty much part of almost all US graduate student funding. So in that case, it's kind of like a job. The research assistantship is also kind of like a job but instead the funding could be from your lab or department. And basically that funding is for you to do research. So in your offer letter, upon being accepted of a graduate program, it will highlight these differences and say like where the money comes from and what the obligations are. So like in terms of teaching or doing research for that. But when applying, you don't have to worry about that. Actually, I didn't know what the difference between TAing and RAing was until after I got in the offer letters, and I was like very confused. So I had to like ask people. For choosing programs, I think I can speak on behalf of just like in general. You don't have to pick the field that you did your undergrad in. So, for example, there's a lot of interdisciplinary research in multiple fields. As long as you can somehow get across in your application that your skills would make you a good applicant for the other fields, it's totally possible to switch fields. So for example, I applied to an ECE program, PhD program, despite never taking a single EE or CE course ever, because I made the case that that program's research I had some background, not in EE or CE, but in the research, like some skills for the research for that lab. Sometimes a program will require that you have decided of which PI to work with, so the offer letter will say explicitly which PI you would work with upon joining the program. Sometimes it wouldn't. So actually, on the other opposite end of that, there's even cases where I've seen a Chem PhD program where the students are required to rotate between 3 different labs in their first year before they're allowed to choose which lab to join. So you can see these both ends of the spectrum, and it really depends on the program. Oftentimes, the field and country of whether or not you have the option to choose which lab, or whether or not you are paired up with a lab at the very start of the program, or that's something that people generally figure out after going there. If you're unclear about that, if you might say on the program website, but if you're unclear, you can also just email and ask. And we also will cover in this workshop how to do cold emails. Lastly, about switching fields on this slide. So my undergrad research was almost all molecular spectroscopy algorithms. So I definitely switched from pretty different fields, I would say. Like it's pretty far off. So there was still some quantum chemistry involved and quantum physics involved. So that made the jump to quantum computing a little bit easier, but still it was pretty different to go from basically chemistry research to computer science research. So switching fields, like not just via the application program, and also like just switching research fields is something that's totally possible. And Alberto told his story about that. And whenever switching fields, if you have a rec letter in the field that you would like to go into, or some other connection or collaborator, colleague, or class that can speak to your skills or reasons for switching fields, that's a highly recommended thing to do. Any, Sam, Pavisa, and Alberto, do you have anything to add about switching fields? I know we kind of covered it earlier.
Yeah, I think I personally covered my end of the spectrum, but just again to review, I found out about quantum computing via quantum machine learning because I was in a CS background, so that kind of made sense, and just doing a lot of self-study and open source projects helped me find the direction that I wanted to take when I applied to grad school. So yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And we're also working and collaborating on open source projects. So afterwards we'll have a survey by one of our admins, Gianty. So it's an anonymous survey where we will just ask you about not just your feedback for the workshop, but also future events that you might be interested in. And some just asking about your prior knowledge in areas related to quantum computing knowledge so that we can help develop better resources to support and help people like Sam who mostly self-learned via like online open source resources. Here's our question slide for this topic. So yeah, we have in our notes here, but anyone want to jump in for any of the questions?
So maybe I could help on the jump from theory and experiment. So initially I was in a purely experimental field, and even though I'm still in physics, you kind of have a very clear distinction in how theory and experiment is taught. And so like usually in theory, whether it be courses or whether it's just a research work, you focus on a few topics, but you go like you cover them in depth. Whereas in experimental courses or projects, you cover several topics, but you don't actually go into the depth or try to find the foundations of where those principles come from. So sometimes you might be torn between whether you want to choose something in experiment or theory in case you want to do a project. And a project in experiment and theory, if you decide to choose specifically one thing, could actually have a very huge difference between them. At least I could say so in at least for the field of physics. But if you can, and you can find a very good potential supervisor for you with whom you can discuss properly about your interest in case you have anything specific you could actually talk to them openly about how you would like to have your thesis or project or whatever designed. In my personal case, when I was doing my bachelor thesis, I didn't want to go for something purely experimental because back then it was particle physics, and something purely experimental means these days it has come too much into the field of just pure data science or else just pure engineering. And I didn't want either of them. And if it's theory, then it has become way too theoretical and way too imaginative. And people from anyone who is interested in particle physics might know what I'm talking about. So I talked to my supervisor about having something that's between the two of them so that that I don't have to choose. And given that most of the people might be having a research experience as their first time, because not all the universities would have a research facility or supervisors who could support you in whatever research you want to do. You really don't have to hurry into choosing whether it's a theory or experiment. You could try it out first and talk with them. But the most important thing is that you communicate your needs to your supervisor soon enough. And I would also like to add a little bit more about what Leah told initially about the distinction between a grad school in Europe and North America. In Europe, the master's and PhD is considered as a clear cut. They are very different. Master's is considered to be a professional degree where you show your experience that you are qualified to be a professional, whereas PhD is solely an academic excellence degree where it's like you want to show that you're very good at it, then you can go ahead to the PhD. And like she said, there are pros and cons. But for masters mostly in Europe, a lot of people who start with their bachelor's, they always go ahead and do their masters and finish before entering the workforce. And like some countries, like Leah said, would have a research-based degree or a taught degree, which is especially the case when it comes to UK. But there are also countries like the Netherlands, Germany, or France, where the master's degree is actually a combination of both. For out of the 2 years, you'll have 1 year of pure coursework and 1 year of pure research work, because our bachelor's we do it for 3 years, and in the 3 years, every student will get almost at least 8 to 9 months of compulsory research experience. So all this research you do in your bachelor's and master's is more like a preparation for a person to start doing a PhD. So by the time you start a PhD, in case you want to, you will be more equipped and you will be knowledgeable about how to actually work in a research environment, research ethics, which is very, very different from working in a corporate world. So your master's basically is like a preparation to start doing your PhD. And unlike the US, where you spend your first 1 or 2 years trying to cover the coursework, the theory background you might need for your PhD dissertation, in Europe, those are the things that you do during your master's, and you just jump head right into the research when you start a PhD. And the main cons of doing a PhD is the kind of determination and patience you need, because it is a very long commitment. So unless you are not sure about whether you want a PhD or not, there is like absolutely nothing wrong in waiting to finish your master's and then taking a break year to decide whether you want to go into academia, corporate, it doesn't matter. So in Europe, when you are a PhD student, you are not technically considered as a PhD student. You are more like an employee, and you will be treated in that way. So you are expected to be more independent. You are expected to do your own research. You have to pitch in your own ideas, come up with new research experiments. So independence is something that is extremely valued in European courses. And if you want to try to choose a specific field within quantum computing or like physics or computer science or whatever in general, you should also try to understand how actually the funding and stuff work in scientific environment, because usually the professor and the postdocs in a group go through all the effort of making a proposal, getting companies to fund for them. But when they are actually coming down to the student, it is not so easy to understand, because most of us are really blind when we are studying, and we struggle after we finish studying to understand how this whole concept of scientific funding works. So most of the time, if you're planning to apply for a certain university and you are not sure about which specific field inside it that you want to go into, you could always go to the department website where they will show you the highlights of the different kinds of research they are doing. And usually you can check from the press releases about how much of the funding is allocated to each of those research group. And in universities, you have these research groups for the namesake, but they are actually dormant. They won't be doing any much research because they probably wouldn't be able to secure funding. And only like 3 to 5% of the funding goes to them, and 60% of the funding goes to some like field that could actually have a potential outcome for industry pretty soon. So it is better to actually understand how the funding structure works if you are interested in it, because that funding is what that decides whether a professor can actually take 2-3 students as his PhD, whether he can support that many master students or not. And Leah will explain you how to cold email professors and potential supervisors. So sometimes you can actually approach a professor and he might be nice and he might reply you back, but he really won't have the funding to support a PhD student. So you should also look whether there is a possibility of a professor taking you in, and that is where the funding comes in. So you really should start looking. And if someone is specifically interested in Germany, I could give them a hint. There is a site called the Share Rankings, and I'll try to put the link over here, where you can check all the universities and their departments and how funding and research is split between them. You can see it in a pie chart, at least I've seen for the physics department, of how much of the funding of or like research of that university goes into a specific field, like say 30% into particle physics, or 60% into condensed matter and like solid state systems, and 10% into soft matter physics or something like that. So you can kind of have an idea. And also when you want to pick a university but not sure, try to find a university that focuses on at least 3 or more topics that you are interested in out of the shortlisted topics that you want to work in. Like they have multiple professors, and it's not bachelor. So in bachelor's, what you do is a general degree. Regardless of what major you are doing, you are taught all the basic skills, the generic modules that will be taught to literally every other bachelor student around the world. But master's is a very specific thing where you choose to study what you want to research in. So that 1 year of preparation with taught courses before you start the research is actually aimed at the research that you are going to do. So it's better to choose a university that can actually support you with the theory side, where they also offer modules if you want to do research in a specific field. And in case you try one field and you don't like it, you could still switch to another field within the same university. So look for a place where you have the freedom of choice and not restrict yourself to universities that is focusing on just 2 fields. Yeah, so that's it.
Wow, that was a lot of good points. I should take notes. I guess there's a video. I also wanted to clarify something I said earlier. I said that in the US and Canada, it's like in the US, it's less common for physics students to do master's programs just because there are not that many. Oftentimes, the master's programs that physics students go into are more engineering focused. But for computer science and for other engineering fields, masters are pretty common. Actually, you can check if your university has a +1 program. So what that means is, or it might be called BSMS. So a lot of undergrad universities, a few of them have programs for specific fields where if you've done an undergrad at that university for an extra year, you can get a master's too. And you can start that master's coursework as an undergrad after you've been accepted to that program. So that's something to look into. That's pretty attractive for a lot of US undergrads. And also, after doing a master's course, if you then decide to do a PhD, then you would have already covered the coursework involved in a PhD program. So you can see if that would transfer. I guess we'll move on for time and come back. Yeah, so actually we'll stop now for questions from the chat. I think we've covered all the, oh, actually we should cover this one on the slide. So this question of how to choose the programs and universities to apply to. What I did was I just went to my professor's office hours in March, the year I was applying. So like 6 months before, or 6 months before I'd started my applications. And then just he was in the field that I wanted to go into, quantum computing. So I just asked him what programs he would personally apply to, and then I just took his list. So, and then I later, after that summer, added a few more universities, made some changes because then I decided I wanted to apply to programs in quantum computer architecture and quantum compilation specifically, rather than quantum computing in general. I'll just type in chat answer to Rodrigo's question. So this website link is where it's the website we're currently building, and it's where the recording of this video would be up on after. We'll cover rec letters in, I think, 2 or 3 sections. 2 sections.
I think Bavitra also mentioned the website for German unis.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
If you
that
could
was
also put that in. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, yeah, that was the question. That was, yeah. That'll be in the slides, so I'll share the slides after, and all the links that we're talking about, you can go find in the slides after. Question from Duncan. Even for PhD programs that don't require you to be matched with a thesis advisor prior to your acceptance, is it still possible to reach out directly to a PI of interest and have them request you in their lab? Yeah, we'll cover that in 2 sections with cold emails, but yes, we recommend reaching out to a PI for whatever program you're applying to, at least one PI, because that can help guarantee that your application is at least looked at. So I actually had a situation where one of my applications was lost, and that was the one program that I just not been on top of emailing. I just hadn't sent a cold email. All the programs where I sent a cold email, my application was not lost. So that's an extreme scenario. Okay. Some of the other questions we will probably cover in the upcoming sections, so we'll get to that. Yeah, let's move on. And how to choose which programs to apply to will also be in our timelines, which is right now. So we'll show our application timelines. So which month, what we did in that month. And we've said before what countries you're from and what countries we applied to. So we're showing these application timelines to get a general idea. Of course, it will depend on where you're applying to. For example, in the US, there's a national deadline for deciding which graduate school to attend of April 15th. And almost all graduate schools in the US adhere to that deadline, which means that if you're applying to the US and other countries, for example, Europe has mostly rolling deadlines, sometimes with a priority deadline that's a harder deadline. But then you might have to make a decision before you've gotten all your offers or some other conflict of interest between the deadlines to decide and when you've received your offers between countries and regions throughout the world. And so it's also can be a tough call because some of the offers might have funding, and so in the US, usually it's the offer itself that has the funding package included with it for PhD programs, and then in Europe and the UK, usually it's funding is something you find after you start. So the process for funding usually, except for some fellowships, the process for finding funding is usually after you've started the program. And I guess we'll answer this question right now. My answer is that I didn't have previous contact other than the kind of cold email that I emailed. I cold emailed actually a different professor that I'd also been interested in working with, and that professor said that he wasn't taking on any students the coming year, but that his former colleague, his colleague was, and actually this coming fall, I'm going to start with a PhD supervisor who I didn't even know was going to be an option that at a university I could apply to, because he moved universities this coming year from a university I could not apply to a university I could apply to. So that's one reason to cold email. You never know.
Yeah, if there's any takeaway from this presentation, it's to never be afraid of reaching out to potential supervisors, and just don't be afraid to cold email. But we'll get to that.
Yeah, but I guess the short answer is that it doesn't matter if it doesn't really matter if you've had previous contact or not, because the way most people go about applying is via cold emails. So that's overwhelmingly how that process works. You don't have to personally know the person you're applying to work with, although that of course is helpful. So here's the first of 2 slides showing our application timeline. So our initials are on the left-hand side, and then it just shows in general, like what we did. So there's some commonalities for applying to grad schools in all countries. So you start by deciding what programs, asking for rec letters, taking the GRE at some point, taking a language test if that applies. You might apply for a visa, but you apply for a visa before your course starts. Sometimes you can apply after the application cycle. You can apply for fellowships. So we can talk about fellowships in a bit. You do a lot of essays. So unlike undergrad applications, at least in the US, and I've seen in other countries too, you can have a common application or some other, you can use the same essay for all programs. Actually, for grad school, that just doesn't work. And they'll have very specific prompts sometimes, or just even general prompts. The prompts will be different in word constraints or page constraints, or what exact questions they're asking, and you have to include a note about like their university specifically. So definitely start the essays early. I will note that I had to communicate with my undergrad PI that during fall quarter my senior year of undergrad, I was not really available for I communicated in advance because I knew I wouldn't be available to do as much research because I was just doing grad apps. So definitely give yourself time for that. Yeah. Anyone do you have anything to add to these?
Yeah, I could cover about the Europe. For
hello?
depending on the country and university, you might have 2 cycles per year. One for which you have to apply around November, December, which is not the usual start. But then also the normal one is around March, April. If you wish to apply to the European universities, you should at least start looking for a course. For the usual cycle, if it's March and April, you have to start looking around November, December. And then if it's master's and it's just paperwork, you have to make sure that your undergraduate degree has a content that is equivalent to what might be taught in an undergraduate of the country for which you are applying to, because that is what they use to actually compare whether you are fit to do their master's program. As for the PhD, it's usually rolling. So as soon as the professors start getting funding, or some universities decide to form like honor school or something, they start taking in new postdocs and PhDs. So if you can try to keep yourself updated about the scene that's going on in quantum computing, probably through LinkedIn or their official websites, you can sign up for mailing list. And professors usually specify which exact field that they are planning to take a PhD student in. It's not like I'm going to take master's student or PhD student and then just leave it there. They specify exactly under which topic they are looking for, and all the details are given. And there are sites called Quantiky and then Quantum Flagship, which is like a European consortium for all the universities and institutions working on quantum computing under the European Union grant. So you just have to find out where to look for, because the PhD applications in Europe doesn't always have a very streamlined application portal like you will see in Canadian or US universities. So it is very specific to the research group or the university, the firm that you are planning to do. And usually in LinkedIn, I've seen a lot of posts where a professor or someone, they just randomly say, I am planning to take 2 or 3 PhD students in this field and all. So if you can, keep yourself updated on the field. Like Leah said, you have to cold email them saying that you are interested in it. And usually it is the professor who chooses you and they decide whether they want to take you in, and then only the application to the university starts. For the North American universities, it's the other way around. The university chooses who is qualified to do their PhD, and then the professor chooses whether this person in their group or not. So usually Europe has a rolling application cycle for PhD. And as for visa application, if you're coming from Asia, especially, you should give yourself time at least 3 to 4 months for the whole visa process. So the best thing would be to actually look at the application even before the application round starts. Keep all the documents you need to apply for, have all your certificates certified by the foreign ministry, which is usually the case, and have it all ready and applied as soon as within the first week of the application cycle opening, so that you will get your answer from the university or the professor as soon as the application cycle ends, which is usually the third week of July for most of the countries. So, and you can start the visa processing as soon as you get them, because a lot of universities in the Europe, they can start anywhere from end of August to end of October. So you don't exactly have a fixed month during which everything starts. So yeah, apply during the first week of whatever university you want to apply to, and which will ensure that you get your answer soon enough.
Another thing to note is that depending on the application process for each program, some programs will have interviews and some programs will not. Some programs will require rec letters and some will not. Some will require the GRE and some won't. So all that you can tell on the application website, or you can start the application process and then see how it works. So we can cover all of those things, but note that many of the stuff we cover won't be applicable to every program that you're applying to. It's just having all the info there is helpful. And yeah, this is the kind of one of the more weird parts of the application process is how to ask for rec letters and how to ask and cold email potential PIs. So I guess the first thing I will note is that for asking for rec letters, don't feel intimidated or hesitant to ask. If you ask and a rec letter writer is not able to write the rec letter, for example, if they're not available, or basically it's usually when they're not available, then you wouldn't know until you asked. And also, every rec letter writer, most people have had to have rec letters written for them in the past, and so it's kind of only fair, I guess, that someone else can write a rec letter for you, since that's just how this kind of works. So many rec letter writers have had rec letters written for them in the past, basically. So that's one reason not to feel guilt about asking. These information on who to ask for rec letters, you can probably ask around or find online, but the TLDR is that for graduate programs specifically, they prefer rec letters from professors and employers. If you've done research with a graduate student or a postdoc mentor, likely they would be involved in writing the letter, but it's the PI that would submit the letter. So it's basically because a letter from a PI is more respected because of the reputation for applying to graduate programs. So one professor told me that postdoc letters are usually not given much weight unless the postdoc is a clear superstar. So I think that's about verbatim what that professor said. There's some programs that can require up to 4 letters, but that's really rare. So most of the time, most programs will require 2 to 3. Next on the next slide, I can show a spreadsheet that I used for keeping together all my deadlines, and as well as some tips. Also, if you're asked to write your own letter, there's a good guide on, if you just Google or search up how to write your own rec letter, like this guide from WikiHow will come up, and that's what I used. It was very helpful. But basically, it's pretty common, or not uncommon, for rec letter writers to ask you to draft your own letter, and that's pretty common. You don't have to worry about that. Worry about like the ethical part of that, because ultimately that rec letter writer will still read that letter, make edits, and what they submit is something that you won't know exactly what they submit. And it's just so that they have some material about you to start with. So So it's just their way of asking more about you, and ethically there really isn't any issue with that as far as I know. There are some, I had one of my applications, all the rest were fine, that asked whether I knew about the content in the letters. And for that, I did disclose that I had written the draft letter, but had no clue what eventually was sent to them. And that there could be, in addition to like the rec letter writer wanting to know more about you, another reason they might ask is if, for example, English is not their first language, if it's an English application. So if, or I guess they're just busy, or there could be a variety of reasons, and so that's pretty common. So sometimes that's like kind of something that you might have to do that at least I didn't expect I had to do. And so now I'll move on to this slide. This slide is a screenshot of exactly the spreadsheet that I use to keep track of my rec letter deadlines for myself and for my rec writers. I redacted the names just for protecting privacy, but at the very bottom of the spreadsheet screenshot, you can see the different pages on the sheet. So it says for Rec 1, Rec 2, Rec 3, Rec 4. I had one application where I needed 4 letters, but that was kind of a pain actually. And so what I've done here is I've, on the very leftmost column made a status, kind of like a checkbox column where it's like whether or not I've done this item yet. And then the date column is the date that item is due. So I even broke it up if there were multiple deadlines for a certain app. For example, if the rec letter deadline was separate from my submission deadline. And I also noted whether if it was a hard deadline, because there's some applications, particularly external fellowships, where it's a hard deadline. And if you miss that, you're just not considered. That's pretty brutal. Whereas there's many graduate school programs you can be slightly late, but it doesn't look good if you're late. So definitely don't leave it to the last second. But for rec letters specifically, it's good for the recommenders to know whether it's a hard deadline or not, because oftentimes recommenders know that graduate programs are okay with them submitting a few days late. So if you know that the rec writer is a few days late, definitely send reminder emails, but don't have to panic unless you know it's a hard deadline. I put all the action items in this column with links to what the program description was, so the rec letter writer can see what program I'm applying to. So like, and also like what components I would have and what kind of like researcher, whether it required coursework, like all those different types of stuff. It helps them with writing the letter. And also they can see whether they have colleagues at that university that they could address directly in their letter. So that's not something, it's a lot of work for rec letter writers to do that for every letter. So I haven't heard of people doing that for like all their letters, but I wouldn't know. But if their colleague is at that university, it's definitely possible to ask, or at least give the possibility that the rec letter writer could mention that colleague directly. So in this rightmost column, I put in who I'd like to work with at that university. So there at least would be a possibility that the rec letter writer could address that colleague if it was their collaborator, colleague, or just someone they knew. I also put all the requirements necessary for that program. So like the number of essays or number of rec letters. And in this column, I put which recommenders to choose. So this was advice from one of my rec writers who said that because some of my programs I was applying to required less recommendation letters than others, I would basically have to choose which writers to use for which programs. And so one of my rec writers was notoriously bad at deadlines. So anything that was a hard deadline, I basically did not let that person touch. I mean, I tried to make it so that my application didn't hinge on that person. Like use the other letters.
We do have a question in the chat asking how long should a recommendation letter be, and if there is a suggested word limit.
I'm not sure, because instructions for rec writers is sent to them, not to the student. So that's something you never have to worry about unless you are the one writing the rec letter, like way down future in your career maybe. So that's something that you never have to worry about. If a professor or some other person asks you to write your own rec letter, just you don't have to worry about the length. I would say like 1 to 2 pages is like just ideal. I haven't heard of like usually rec letters are not super long, but they if you're writing your own rec letter, I'd say 1 to 2 pages. Maybe
I think this
like
question can
1
also
to
be
1.5.
translated into, I think this question can also be translated into the essays that you write for your application. So, are there any suggestions when it comes to your statement of purpose?
Yeah, that's gonna come after. So actually, sometimes instead of writing your own rec letter, you might also some rec letter writers might also ask for your statement of purpose so that they can see about how you're describing yourself and your experiences and what you're applying to and your like goals down the line. So that's in 2 sections, I think. Yeah, this is very
Yeah, maybe-
comprehensive. So
maybe like can I add a few
yeah, add anything.
recommendation letter? In Europe, for my bachelor's and master's, I personally didn't have to get any recommendation letters done because I did my bachelor's here as well. But like she said, like Leah said, sometimes a professor or like your PI might ask you to write your own letter, or sometimes what happened in my friend's case was like the professor who was planning to write the recommendation letter for him asked for what are the like qualities or features or skills of him that he would like to highlight. So I think you should be knowing it yourself too, because if someone came and asked me that question out of the blue, I really wouldn't be able to answer it. So for certain like PhD positions, the application might actually require certain skills which you might have acquired in your previous research projects. So when you're trying to approach a professor to ask for recommendation letter, be also sure that whether you have any specific qualities that you would like to be highlighted. And also please make sure that you find someone who has actually worked with you or has actually taught you in a class than someone who has just been a professor for one of your modules but have never seen in a class, because they can actually write you a recommendation letter. Even if it's small, they could still write you something only if they know you personally. And in most of the cases for grad school application, a generic recommendation letter is more damaging than something that's actually, it's written in a bad way. So just make sure that someone and he or she is motivated, he or she is smart, something like that. You should to highlight this person is extremely good at doing these things, certain spectroscopy skills or picking up theory fast or something like that. Yeah,
I realized.
so that would be it.
I really recommend following that advice. I think that's really solid advice when it comes to getting recommendation letters, because it can create a very big impact. And you got to make sure that the people that you're reaching out for to get these letters for, they can help you out in just as much of a capacity as you need them to be. So be careful if anyone has any schedule conflicts, or if you haven't worked enough with them to maybe build a good enough relationship with them, that can sometimes adversely affect your application. So it's something to be careful about.
Oh, and also always ask your professor first whether they would be willing to write you one before asking them to write you one. So just don't randomly email out of the blue asking for a recommendation letter. First ask them whether they would be okay with writing you a recommendation letter, because that is the question with which you will be able to find out whether the professor will actually give you a good letter or not. Because that professor, let's say that professor replies, no, I'm not willing to write, then you will know it's better. You have known that it's better not to ask him. Or else sometimes the professor might not actually know you and he will ask you, is there anything that you would like me to highlight or something? He'll ask input from you, during which you can actually give your input. So it's always better to ask first, and then and they might also ask you for, like, usually if it's a professor who has only been your, let's say, a teacher for certain modules but has never been a partner with you in any of your research projects, then they might ask you about your research background, maybe send a old report or of a research project that you did before. They might ask you for extra resources before writing it.
Like a resume or CV.
Yeah. So just along with the resume and CV, they might also ask you to give a research profile of what you have done. So be ready to supply them with whatever resources that you have, like about you. Because like if you only give your CV or something, they could only highlight what's there on the CV if they don't know you personally. Yeah.
I've also heard of like interviews, or by interviews I mean like in response to someone asking for a rec letter, like the professor or rec letter writer would ask if they could meet with the student in person to just write down some things and ask some questions that would be helpful for writing the letter. I realized I forgot
that is actually a good thing.
Yeah, I
ask
realized I
them for an
forgot.
appointment. I'm sorry for interrupting.
I realized I forgot to add something. So actually, for this Google spreadsheet, the reason why I recommend that is because you can share it with anyone. You can update it live, and it's not like, so if it becomes out of date. For example, I had a application that I was gonna apply to, and then I ended up not applying to because I got acceptances before the application deadline. Just that's a con of applying to multiple countries. And so what I did was I copy and pasted every row of this spreadsheet into separate sheets specific for each rec letter writer. So what a rec letter writer would do is like look at the sheet, see the title, and then click on the bottom for their specific deadlines. So they could see just their deadlines and not the deadlines of other rec letter writers or my deadlines. And so that helps a lot. When you fill out an application, you could actually start the physical application paperwork. I mean, by physical, I mean online. In advance, because what it will require you to do is to type in your contact info of your rec letter writers, and then it will automatically trigger an email to them of that soliciting their recommendation and the details of that and how to submit it. So whenever that is triggered, I recommend sending an email to that rec letter writer saying that rec app for this program was triggered. And because sometimes an email that they've never received before could easily go to spam. Actually, it's definitely happened before. So by doing that, and you can see on the application portal whether or not that person has submitted their rec letter yet. So if they haven't submitted, in a few days, you can just send a follow-up email or something like that. And you can even, while asking your rec letter writer in the first place whether they'd be willing to write you a rec letter, also ask them if they prefer how many days in advance to know about a deadline and how many days to be reminded of, that kind of stuff, because every person has different preferences for that. And now we move on to the, I guess, the scariest part, cold emails. About cold emails, there's some really good guides online about how to write a good cold email. So what we'll say specifically is just, since you can all look that up, what we'll say specifically is how to do it for graduate school. The when to ask, Sam says the earlier you ask, the better. And
as soon as you know about the kind of program and the kind of a PI that you want to work with, in my personal experience, it's really best to like reach out as soon as possible, because even if your applications due like 6 months or 7-8 months in the future, it just helps the PI learn more about you, and that could help both learn about the kind of research that the PI is doing, what kind of funding the PI is currently having in their group or lab, and how they can support you. There's a lot of things that you can clear out just by connecting as early as possible. So that's something that I personally recommend, but it could vary according to the situation you're in.
I also recommend in the few weeks before applying, that being a time to reach out if you haven't yet. Just because after you turned in the application, if you aren't able to contact the potential PI by the time the applications are looked at, you might risk that PI doesn't get to see your application. So for example, I know of one university program whose application process is that they have a committee. So in addition to graduate admissions for the whole university, that department has a committee of PIs from all the subfields of physics, one per subfield. So, for example, condensed matter experiment, condensed matter theory, like AMO, it just everyone. And so that person is the representative for all the different groups within that field. So if the PI you'd like to work with isn't on that admissions committee, then they might never see your application without reaching out. So that's just some like bureaucratic reason to reach out, I guess. There's definitely some programs where they say on the program that you'll find a PI after starting. And in that case, it's still nice to reach out. And that would also give you a sense of ultimately when you decide programs, how you feel about each program. But in that case, there isn't as much time pressure to reach out. So in addition to cold emails, which we'll, I guess, focus on the next few minutes, you can also ask a mutual connection to introduce you, or in your cold email, mention the mutual connection that you might have. If, for example, pretty common if you're working in the same field for graduate school, researching in the same field is you could mention in the subject line of the cold email that you previously did research with X person. And I also highly recommend in the subject line say like master's or PhD advisor solicitation. So what that will do is that will separate you from, I guess, the pack of some PIs can get hundreds of emails a day. So if you specifically mention it's for a long-term commitment to be a graduate student researcher in their lab, that can catch their attention a lot more effectively than if it's just another one of the hundreds of emails that a PI might get per day. You can also approach at a conference or event. I've done that before, and it went really well. Yeah, you just approach and introduce yourself and say that you're interested in working with them for graduate school. Preferably during like coffee breaks or any other like water cooler talk. There's usually lots of opportunities to socialize at events. And also many such conferences, even as an undergraduate, you could get funding to go to. So you can look at different conferences and see if they offer scholarships or funding to go to, or ask your undergrad research lab or any other funding on campus.
Maybe I don't know whether a lot of people would dig this deep, but most of the people really don't know a lot of professors who are working in a lot of these, since it's a new field, a lot of people actually don't know what's going on in certain universities unless they are like very huge names associated with a company like Google or IBM. So one thing for you to find out a professor or a good university is to find out what they're actually researching on. If you're enough to have a good professor at your university who is also working in these fields that you're interested in, or maybe you have done your master's or bachelor research with them, you could kind of try to find out the professors who they have associated with, they have written papers with, so you have a better chance of reaching out to them. It's just like using the you have. You could go to maybe ResearchGate or else like Google Scholar and type out the name of the professor that you have worked with at your home university during your thesis project or summer project or whatever, and just look at the list of the papers that are coming up. And along with the papers, you could see the co-authors of the paper, which might have been the second co-author or else like the first author of the paper. And if you find any of those professors and their research interesting, you could also consider them to be your potential supervisors to reach out to, because you Google for a list of professor, you see a lot of people, but you really don't know whether it's a good choice to approach them or whether it's actually good to go there. But if you do something like a network of a network kind of idea, you could also ask your master thesis or bachelor thesis professor whether he would recommend working under this professor, or whether he would suggest any group for which you can apply to and stuff. So yeah, you could look out for the H index. And also to find out a good professor to work under, there is this idea called H index and I index. It is especially helpful when you're going into a theoretical field like quantum computation, because most of it is like in theory stages these days. Especially in physics, you could go to the profile of the professor in Google Scholar and look at index and I index. It kind of gives you an idea of how much it's just a metric, but it can also give you an idea of how much this person collaborates with other universities or how much he influences other research papers. The H index and I index do have a much deeper meaning, which I don't have to get into, but these are the kind of things with which you can identify good professors. Just know that a good professor doesn't always have to work at a big IBM or Google. Someone might be very good at research and they might be very good at academics, also be a very good supervisor, but they just don't want to work in the corporate, because these days it's kind of a bit difficult to find out really good PIs if they are not with big names. So yeah, this way you can find out who is working in which fields. Yeah, that's it.
I guess if anyone has questions specific to cold emails, we can take them right now in the chat. I will also mention that in cold emails, it's so attaching a resume or CV is helpful for writing a cold email, not preventing like a full application, because when you ultimately apply, and oftentimes the response will be just to apply at the deadline, but now you've notified them of your application, then attaching a resume or CV as an introduction, and the email itself can be pretty short in that it doesn't have to be super long, so that would be just more of an investment to read. But you can take the opportunity to also ask any questions you might have specific to applying to the program. For example, if you're not sure which program within that university to apply to, so some universities actually allow you to submit multiple applications for the same university, for example, different fields. Or I've seen the case where someone who applied for a PhD program at a university was accepted to their master's. So that's something that can also happen. So something that probably is something good to ask is also what kind of research that the PI is thinking about giving to incoming graduate students. So like in this language, if I were to, I'd like to join your group, what problems are you working on in your group that I would be able to get started with upon joining? So that kind of question, it's good to ask, because in addition to like what the group is, you would also want to consider like what research you would be working on and what skill sets would be valuable for that research. So, and also having some indication that your email is not just like a copy and paste sent to like hundreds of people. Instead, having some indication that you follow the research and you're interested in specific aspects of the group that you can list out or say about, or talk about how that's influenced you, just really briefly making that email personal and not like mass produced is kind of a must for writing an effective advisor solicitation email, in my opinion. So looking at, I don't see questions in the chat about cold email questions specifically that we haven't covered yet. Okay, well, in that case, we'll move on. And as always, there's the Ask Anything channel after this for anything we've missed or haven't covered. I don't know why, but it's not letting me click. Okay, my Google slide just froze. Well, I'll try to get this figured out. In the meantime, the next slide is about statement of purpose. It's about the different application essays. And so every program will have different essays. Actually, there might be even no overlap with the essays that are required between different programs across different, oh, there, perfect. Different regions or countries or programs. So some of the stuff on this slide actually, oh, okay, well, I refreshed. But depending on the program, you'll need a mix and match of certain essays. And so I've had programs that did not require a statement of purpose. I've had programs that required a diversity essay or had the option to submit it, and also programs that required a research proposal in the application. So these requirements will be stated with the prompts on the application website, or like after you've started the application, I'll say so. So I guess I'll just define the differences, and please jump in, Sam, Alberto, and Pavitra, if there's anything you'd like to add. So I'll just define what these application essays are, and for each of these, you can look up online like guides on how to write them, like kind of general structure. But ultimately, since it's your own story, there's not much in the way of advice that can come. It's just telling your own story, basically. And it's definitely different from applying to undergraduate, where when you're applying to undergraduate, those essays are kind of more speaking to your character and experiences, whereas for graduate applications, it's usually more specific about your career goals and your past experiences when research and project and volunteer and employment experiences and course experiences. Those are things that would be more focused on now that you've like had the past few years of building up those skills and experiences. So to define what these are on this slide, and there's could be more essay topics that are not on this slide. So a statement of purpose is pretty common in graduate applications. What it is it will ask things like your objective, like what you seek to do in this field in the short term and long term, like what your background is, like your experience and what you'd like to do, what you're interested in, those kind of things. And the prompt will usually be very detailed, so you don't have to worry about if you're like basically. I will show some prompts in the next few slides. Those prompts are extremely detailed, so you basically just answer the prompt and has some kind of structure to it. A diversity essay is something that surprises people, especially people applying to programs in the US from outside the US. But some applications, so for example, it's required for graduate programs at the University of California system. So that's like almost a dozen universities. And optional at other places is that it's an essay that's entirely about how you might either be an underrepresented member of this field or of a community, or if you're not, like how, or even if you are, how to contribute to diversity and making the community inclusive. So it might say in the prompt what more specifics on what they're referring to depending on the program. But yeah, it can be sometimes required and hard to write since it's a really different type of essay than most people are used to writing. I think most commonly people write about their like outreach experiences or experiences teaching or experiences tutoring or just experiences that that they've experienced. Yeah, so just keep an eye out for that, I would say, because it catches some people off guard. Lastly, on this slide is a research proposal. So it's sometimes required for graduate school applications, but it's required for many fellowship applications. And so these fellowship applications, at least the ones in the US that are external, so external not being that these applications like, I guess, okay, I'll step back. So there's kind of two types of fellowships, if I had to put in broad categories. That I heard about or had to experience or like know about for applying in the U.S. and there's some commonalities with other countries too. There's fellowships that are so in the U.S. there's fellowships that are external. So these would be from government, from national lab, from like corporations that have an interest in research, and so those are I'm using the language to describe them as external fellowships. So it means that requires a separate application from any graduate program you're applying to, and that those applications usually have a lot more components and may require like more requisites than others. They're usually quite prestigious, and some people even say that they could be a lottery. But applying is a really good like opportunity. Some of those programs even give you feedback on your application. So I actually have a guide to that written a guide to research proposal, but also the application to that I can share afterwards. Since it's written, I won't cover it now, but and another is like fellowships that come from the university, college, department, or department that you're applying to, and that's a funding source that sometimes you're automatically considered with your application to that program. So you don't have to do anything extra on your part, and it's actually usually like a PI has to nominate you for that funding, and so that's another reason to cold email. And that would be like funding that's extra, like just like a cherry on top for the funding that's the default funding package that's offered by the university. And some universities don't do that kind of extra funding at all. So it's hard to know about these. It's about like these kind of like implicit like funding opportunities that you can't directly apply to, but you basically don't have to worry about them. You just do your application as you normally would in that case. So anyway, back to research proposals. For external fellowships or some programs, you do have to write a research proposal, and it might seem really intimidating because because basically it's to write down your ideas, and it's a good experience. The research proposal guide I'll leave to later. I mean, I'll just link it afterwards. Anything to add? Looking at the comments here. Yeah, Babisa had a really good comment to add right here. That's at the bottom.
Yeah, so in Germany, at least from what I know, in some of the states, like everyone is trying to increase the presence of female and gender fluid. A lot of people in STEM fields. So if you're hesitant about whether you'll be qualified enough for a very hardcore STEM field, just don't mind. Everyone is treated equally, at least in Europe. There is no kind of quotas or something for EU citizens and non-EU citizens, at least in the case of Germany, I would say. Most of the time, it is the same for certain countries, at least starting from masters, but there are certain countries in which there is no fee for EU citizens, but there is a fee for international citizens. And also usually when most of the time where for an application, when you have two qualifying candidates, each of them with the same level of qualification, the preference will be given to the female or transgender, like anyone except the male. So that is to actually encourage the female applying, and a lot of professors, when they are putting on their advertisements, they also specify that female candidates and applicants are encouraged. So anyone, and there are also very specific funding for females in a lot of universities, women in engineering, women in tech, and they are very university specific fundings, or else an external funding. There is also European wide funding, the Marie Curie Scholarship, I assume, which I'm not quite sure, but it is usually given as a research funding for PhD students to conduct research and finish their PhD in around 3 to 4 universities within the Europe. So there are several funding, extra funding opportunities available if you are like a female. I could add that if anyone's looking for it too.
Yeah, it's actually pretty controversial currently in the U.S. There's court cases about like how to approach diversity in college admissions. So maybe I'll reach the Supreme Court again. Who knows? Yeah, we're here. So here are just some example prompts. I'll speed through them, but I just wanted to show, like, just to see what the prompts might look like. And so every university has very specific prompts. So sometimes the prompts are generalized to all programs at that university, and on the application they'll ask more specific things. And definitely start the actual paperwork of the application early. So for example, for a program, I had to list every single programming language I'd ever used, and I had to list like every single talk I'd ever given, and like cite it. It was just a lot of paperwork. So these are pretty straightforward, but they're just here in case, just to so that you've seen the prompts before and can start to think about it. Like months in advance or years in advance, maybe. For those of you who are like joining us from like who are planning on applying in like years in the future. Yeah, and this was the prompt for the research proposal that I had to submit for the University of Oxford. So that was actually the only writing that they had required to be submitted. Yeah, I think take a questions break about any of the about the essays, since those questions will probably be specific and I'm linking the research proposal guide afterwards, I'd say we'll just move on from there. For funding, yeah. Well, who made the slide?
Not me. So I have
okay.
already covered what I said here in the previous one. So I could also add, usually when there's a scholarship for masters, like for PhD, like I mentioned before, you are treated as an employee more than a student. So you will be given something like a salary every month. And the typical funding lasts for like 3 years. And if your researches are actually good and you are making process, but you need more time, the funding period can always be extended up to 4 or 5 years. But it depends on how the funding situation is in your group. The professor has to fund you for the next 4 or 5 years, but it depends on whether you are actually making progress in your PhD research. But for masters, and if there are any scholarship applications, usually while you are applying for the normal master's degree during the application cycle, at least in Germany, they are considered as a subcategory within the application for the honors school. There you have to send a recommendation letter or statement of purpose and such. And they usually have an interview associated with it. And during that interview, you are most of the time expected to present what you did as your bachelor thesis research. And unfortunately, not every university around the world has a bachelor degree where research is focused in. But you can also present what you did, something like a summer research or something that can show that you have research skills, not something like a typical presentation that you would live in a class, that you would give in a class. And most of the time, a lot of people I've seen, what they present is their summer research project or their bachelor's research project. Then that is like the final interview kind of thing that is used to decide who will be getting the scholarship and who won't be. Oh, and for PhD, I forgot to mention earlier, when you are cold emailing professors, they also mostly prefer having an interview, one-to-one interview, before, if the university has a panel interview or something, depending on the procedure. Even if it's for a master project or a summer project or whatever, the professor always tries to get to know you. And like Leah mentioned, if you're writing an email to a professor, try to make it more specific than a general application you send to an application portal. If you have also, you can kind of do research about the professor and his research background before sending the email. Like I mentioned before, look up the papers they have written, look at how their research is going, read through the abstracts of some of the papers they have written, see whether there is something specific that you are interested in, and be specific on the email. And if they like and would like to have a interview with you, it's very relaxed, usually from my experience. For my bachelor thesis, I had an interview for about like 1 hour. And for my master thesis application also, I had an interview about like around 60 to 90 minutes, which was quite long. But it's not like a job interview. It's more like an interview to find out whether you are prepared to go into something very research intensive. And they obviously know that you are a new student and why you are doing this degree is to actually learn the field. So they won't always expect you to know about the field already. They will just check whether you know what things you should be knowing. Like, let's say that PhD dissertation involves a measurement of something. And definitely, if you have to measure something, there are certain measurement techniques, spectroscopy techniques that you might be needing. They'll just ask you to check whether you know what kind of techniques could be used, what kind of techniques are currently possible, and those kind of things. So you don't have to fret much. Just make yourself aware about what research is going on, and that is how the interview goes. And if that interview is successful, you could to follow up with. They'll ask you about funding. They'll personally talk to you, and then only this application to the university where you just formally get enrolled, and those things happen. I'm sorry, I forgot.
A question? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Okay. About PhD funding, most of the points are similar to what Ravitha just said. I don't think there's that much difference to say. For PhD funding, you're automatically considered for funding when you apply to a program, because every program has funding available for applicants. But some programs give it funding to guarantee funding for all successful applicants, and some programs don't. So there might be cases where you can get, it's in Europe, for example, it's common to get an acceptance without a guarantee of funding, but it's sometimes actually, it could be easier to find funding afterwards, because by that time once you committed to a program, then the funding, basically, you know which field and area and topic of research you'll be going to. Whereas in the US and Canada, usually the funding funds the person. So even in your research proposals that you write for fellowships, external fellowships, or even if you switch labs, like that funding is still there. Even if you end up doing research that's completely different to what you had planned on doing when you got the funding. Some of the funding actually has strings attached, or by strings attached, it will say in the funding what it requires. So we mentioned before TA-ships and RA-ships, but there could also be, like, if the funding is from a company, a corporation, they might want you to intern with them, or from a national lab, or do a co-op with them. So there could be some teaching requirements. In Europe, you can, even if TAing might not be part of the funding package as often, you can still teach at the university. It's just that you would apply separately for that. And since a common question that I've gotten and seen that we got for this workshop in advance was how to apply to funding in the EU, and the UK as a student in the US, or a student not in the EU in UK. So I saw a statistic that a majority of people who are doing graduate study funded in Europe have received the funding from their home country, but there's still many funding opportunities that are available from European sources. For the UK specifically, I guess the three main places where funding is from, I guess, are like the scholarships available might be restricted to just UK students, or just EU students, or students from Commonwealth countries. So the US is not a Commonwealth country, so it's actually pretty hard to find US funding in the UK, but definitely doable. It's just that you might have to be a bit more creative with funding sources of, like, looking around. So there's a lot of more well-known or government funding sources, but I also had friends apply to funding sources that were like some foundations of, like, some, I think, disease couple. I don't know. Anyway, you'll have to look around. So there's, like, sometimes people just, like, the estate of some diseased person makes some scholarship or something like that. In the US, there's national fellowships, so those are extremely competitive, but they're available for students who wish to go abroad and have funding specifically for that. And so I applied to the Marshall Scholarship unsuccessfully, but like, those scholarships are just like usually run by the US national government, and your every university can nominate up to a certain number of students for consideration of that fellowship. And so usually you would have to apply to your university first, and that deadline is usually months in advance of the actual graduate applications. and then there's some complicated, like, long process with interviews or stuff. But that process is really helpful. At least I found it really helpful to go through, even though it was a lot of paperwork. So that's something to definitely look out to. Go to the info sessions of, and although like all these fellowships are like, some of them can look like lotteries or crapshoots, still going to those info sessions can really give you information on how to apply and differences between countries, or even study abroad sessions at your university. Like, they would have, those people would know information on like how just kind of norms and cultural norms, and as like the processes in different countries too. And so just don't be afraid to reach out, to reach out probably wider than like the immediate program you're applying to. Okay.
And
Yeah.
maybe I could add something. So when it comes to funding in Europe for masters, like Leah mentioned, there are certain scholarships and funding possibilities that open up once you have admission or enrollment. So always research about the things that will be possible after you get your admission and keep them aside. And once you get your admission, you could also try looking up for more scholarships, which will be available once you are like ready to be enrolled. And during your first year at the university, also you will get access to more scholarship based on like merit-based scholarships. So you should kind of find out what kind of unlocks, I would say, at different stages of your application procedure and your enrollment procedure. And then in Europe, you would have something called the teaching duty for undergraduate students. And what I might say is a bit controversial, because usually when you are a PhD student, everyone complains that their time is being wasted because they are expected to do a lot of TA and not given enough time to do their research. And it all depends on how you pick your supervisor to be. So if you pick a good professor who also values your research and not uses you just as a teaching assistant, so that is very beneficial. So make sure that you find a supervisor who is good, and you can usually find out by making contact with a PhD student who has worked under that professor before. And it's actually kind of a good idea to reach out to a PhD student who has worked under a professor to whom you are planning to send a cold email to. Ask them like whether the professor has positions available, open, or how their research plan is moving, because usually they can give you an insight about how the research group is at the moment. And to be honest, the research environment is a very important thing that you have to consider, not just funding, because if you don't have a nourishing research environment, you really won't be able to progress in your career. So yeah, that is one thing.
Thanks for that. The summary of this slide is just that funding is important. So I'm kind of using that to make the case for this slide, which is that I guess if you walk away with no other, like, if you're the number one takeaway, I hope people walk away from this, is that just apply. Don't be scared to apply to more programs and more fellowships and just more opportunities that are out there. So even I applied to several fellowships, got quite mostly rejections. Just they're pretty competitive, and although they were very time consuming, I found that I really learned a lot from the process and would highly recommend anyone else also apply. I had a lot of friends who didn't apply to fellowships, and I think there's a lot of self-selection for people who are applying, but like, if there's nothing stopping you from applying, I highly recommend going for it. I think I made a list of reasons to apply for fellowships. There's actually one reason that's not on here. The learning experience, as I've said. So my friend and I found that after writing research proposals for these fellowships, we had a better clue of what our research would be like by the time we did the graduate applications, like 2 months later. Some of these fellowships get feedback. So in my research proposal guide, I've actually attached the feedback that I got from the NSF GRFP, which is the most the most widely applied like the fellowship in the U.S. For STEM masters and PhD students. Yeah, and so that feedback is really valuable. I even had a professor tell me that when applying for fellowships as a faculty member, as a new faculty member, that professor recommended like that they would apply for the same fellowship like 3, 4, 5 times until they got it. And because of that feedback, they can improve upon it. And so many of these fellowships even also allow you to apply again after receiving the feedback. And the third reason is that there's flexibility if you have a separate funding source. So not only is extra money nice, but having a funding source that isn't from the program you apply to can help you with switching labs if that comes to happen, which is actually not uncommon and is doable. And I've even heard of people switching universities mid PhD or mid program. So that flexibility can be nice, and also would relieve you of teaching obligations so that you could focus more on research. Fourth point that I guess I didn't put on this slide was that like many of the graduate applications, at least that I saw, were asked you explicitly which fellowships you've applied to and to list all of them. So obviously they won't tell you why they ask this, but basically from the graduate program's perspective, if they give a fellowship from them to a student who is going to get a fellowship and take it from outside the university anyway, it's a good deal financially, or it's a good deal financially for them in general, because instead of the university having to fund the student, it's the university saves a lot of money because now it's like some fellowship outside the university that's funding the student. And also it can show that the student is probably more self-motivated in order to put in the like lots of effort required to apply to these fellowships. And in the US, student fellowships fund the person, not the research. So if you win the funding, you don't have to do the exact research in your research proposal. As long as you're in the same program area, your money will still stick around. So as long as you don't like switch general fields, like switch from like CS to bio or some etc. And for many, actually some fellowship deadlines, you might not hear back before the deadline to decide graduate programs for some universities. So this year, possibly due to COVID, but who knows, like the NDSEG National Fellowship in the US just didn't get back to us before April 15th, the US national deadline to decide. So that can be frustrating because in some cases it's heard of where if you get a full fellowship or a funding source, for example, the NSF-GRFP in the US, you can actually negotiate or reach out to and try to contest like any rejected graduate decisions that you had. So I don't think I know personally someone who said that they did that, but I've heard that it's possible and has happened before. So once you have funding, even a program that you were rejected from, now that you're basically free for a few years, they might reconsider like their rejection. So that's something I've heard of, but I don't know much about it. Yeah. I think time-wise we're doing fine. So the rest of the sections are shorter. Just being aware that their interviews and testing exists. There's a really long write-up right here about that Sam did about language stuff. Since this write-up is pretty self-contained, I think it's probably better to thanks Sam for writing it. This is really, really, really detailed. I think it's probably better to just have anyone read this write-up afterwards.
Yeah, I think that'll be best.
Do you think so?
And
Okay.
yeah, no,
Sorry.
yeah, and even no, I understand, and plus we're doing really good on time, so I think the attendees here can take the slides and read it for themselves. But the advice here is pretty straightforward, and I believe a lot of the takeaways do also apply to the GRE papers. From what I've written is specifically in terms of language requirement tests such as the TOEFL or the IELTS. But a lot of the general practices would also apply to general GRE and subject GREs as well.
Yeah.
If you'd like to know more about the subject GREs in detail and if and when to take them and how to study them, I think Leah or Bhavitra could elaborate on that.
About the GRE, I made a note afterwards about the personally what I did to study for the GRE, which worked out really well. And that's also the process I recommended for several of my friends or people who asked me about it. So I'm a native English speaker, so I found this process enough. But for someone who isn't a native English speaker, it would take more preparation. But the good thing is that for the GRE, all the prompts are available online, the essay prompts. So you can get practice with the real essay prompts that are used in the GRE. Except that since there's like, I think, over 100 prompts, you can't like memorize or practice or have outlines for all of them. I mean, you could, but you wouldn't memorize all of them. But at least, you know, I only had to do one interview and it was very casual. But Rita might want to say something about interviews that you kind of mentioned before, like you had a 60 to 90-minute interview. I can't even imagine that.
So during my bachelor's, that was like I said, the professor just I applied for a project in Higgs boson decay that was based on some data analysis of CERN's second run of over 2-3 years. And my bachelor's university didn't focus on particle physics, so most of the stuff was like self-learned. So he really wanted to make sure that I was familiar with particle physics to get started on doing something like an intensive thesis project. So during that whole time period, like I explained, they were just trying to make sure that I knew what I have to know eventually. And then, but I could explain what happened during the interview at the German Aerospace Agency, because that was like very specific to quantum computing. That was like a master thesis thing. And mostly if you're applying to a cold emailing a professor and they're also interviewing you, what they'll try to find out is whether you're a good research candidate for them. And most of the people think that these interviews are like quizzes where they ask you physics related questions and you have to like spot on answer them. But they are most likely to assess what kind of research skills that you can bring to their research group. So they will start with asking you to explain what kind of research projects you have done before, if you haven't done any. Most of the time, everyone has done at least one summer research project. Because basically you are expecting a professor who you have never met or like associated with in any way before to trust you and give you money for 4 years. And that is a very big thing to ask. So that is what they try to assess. Whether you actually know the skills that you have mentioned, you know, in the CV that you sent them before. And usually, yeah, sorry.
I wanted to just insert that you don't have to have research experience to apply for graduate school. So, I've heard of professors describing students who like they had project experience and they could describe that, or employment experience, and that's valued depending on the program, but that can be valued just as much as research experience. So it's not necessary. Yeah, continue, Victor.
Yeah, and also like she said, you could always switch from one field to a new field, but that shouldn't stop you from applying for it. It could be a new field that you didn't do in university or you didn't study before, but even self-learning is extremely valued when you're applying for something like PhD, because you are just you are expected to work independent. So if you can demonstrate the skills of being independent, of being a self-learner, that will be extremely valued. So you usually have this time frame of at least 1 to 2 months of reaching out to a professor and actually going through the whole process of scheduling an interview and getting at it. So you could always get yourself up to speed on whatever it is that you are going to talk with him. Make sure that you can find resources and learn things yourself. It's okay if you don't have a certificate or degree or module on something that you have done at universities. You and certainly explain to the professor that you have worked through or all on yourself to a certain book that covers the theory. And maybe you could say, let's say if it's programming, you could say that you have done you learn Circ by yourself or Qiskit by yourself, because programming is something that you learn by doing and not necessarily by having a module or something. It could of course facilitate it, but it doesn't prove that you have the skills. So if you are a self-learner, just don't be afraid. You can still tell them even in your email that you learned all these things by yourself and you're extremely excited to work with them. So yeah, you don't have, you just have to demonstrate that you have certain qualities that they are looking for from you, not qualifications necessarily.
I'll kind of add something about earlier. We talked about the general GRE earlier. There's also subject-specific GREs. So, for example, the physics GRE is something that exists. And so the GRE and the physics GRE or whatever subject GRE is not necessarily recommended for all programs, but it could be, it's not required. So some programs will require you to submit it as part of the application. Some programs will recommend you submit it, but let you choose whether or not you submit it, or just let you choose. Some programs will require you to submit it if you've taken it, and if not, then they won't. I think I've heard of that. And some programs will just not take it, like just won't allow you to submit it, which is great. It's getting less popular to take for programs to require the GRE over time, but that's still something that is pretty prevalent. I think the physics GRE specifically is being phased out at US and Canada universities in the past few years, and that's continuing to happen. But I do know of a program that currently has a combined GRE and GPA score that is a cutoff score. So although many, hopefully, I think most programs do not have a cutoff score, but there are programs that do. So if you are not happy with your GRE score, that's something that you can retake. And the friends of mine who retook the GRE did, like, all of them did better the second time around. And we have advice for the process and for how to study for the Toefl and the GRE just written in this slide description that we'll share afterwards. As for when to take the GRE, you can take it early and then retake it, or you could take it even up to about the time you apply. Probably recommending taking the general GRE earlier is preferred, because if you've taken the SAT or others kind of standardized testing for your university level, it's not that different. So actually the math in the GRE is about high school level math. So that's all I had to say about that. And time-wise, we're on our last section, and most of it is stuff we've already covered. So this is just, we'll probably first take questions that are specific to applying internationally, and then after that, we'll just take any other questions. So these are questions received in advance that Bavitra can answer.
So if you're applying for a university within Europe, citizenship doesn't always play a major role as long as the research isn't exactly tied to any activities related to the government. So if it's something that is very the space agency or else like military intelligence and stuff, usually it comes with a restriction on the citizenship of the person, but it is not always as restrictive as US, where most of the things are like restricted to only US citizens and residents. So in Europe, if there is to be something like that, they always mention it specifically, because the funding that they are allowed to give to the student will have any restrictions, and they'll mention it on the job application or else like the advertisement saying that it's not a preference, but more like a condition. And most of the time, the only things I've seen like that are ads from certain UK universities because of the recent Brexit. For the other EU universities, like I've never seen a single university saying that a preference will be given to EU citizen or anything. Only the fee or funding status changes, but for PhD, like I said, the salary kind of idea is given for everyone. So your citizenship really shouldn't stop you from applying for anything. But let's say if someone is interested in particle physics, it might be a bit trickier to apply to CERN because it does come with a lot of citizenship restrictions, except for 1 or 2 internships where you don't have such restrictions. Because CERN is necessarily funded by like all those EU countries, so it's like an investment for them. They are putting in money, they want something in return, so they want to train their undergraduates and their countries. So that is one thing, but even that really don't have to stop you because you could study in any of the European university and you could still do research in CERN as a partner of the university. And you could still go to visits for CERN and do your research there during your PhD. So there are workarounds, but that doesn't like it's not a bottleneck. And like I said, European citizenship increase my chances of getting into European schools as an American. No, in no way does your citizenship restrict you or give preferences or anything. Everyone is treated equal, so there is really nothing that you need to be worried about. How does the funding work for master's program in Europe? Yeah. So, like I said, master's is a taught course. There are concept of scholarships in different universities, and some of the countries have free education, and for Germany has universal free education. So, regardless of which country you come from, it's free for everyone, except for like one state. But I don't think it's the other states are going to change it anytime soon. You'll just have to have a very small contribution for each of the semester, but it's in the order of like 500, 600 euros per annum. And it is not an extremely huge amount when you compare it to the fee for like a American university. And but that is not the case for countries like Finland, Netherlands, or Norway. But like I said, some of them do have free education, but there will be language restrictions because most of those free education available are actually taught in their language. So that would be one problem. But as far as the PhDs and masters are taught in English in most of the countries, so you really don't have to worry about any of those things. And is there any other question related to Europe,
Okay.
Germany?
Looking around. There's a question about funding that I answered in chat. So what we can do is we can make a Q&A of all the questions that are in chat, in the Discord, etc., and just put them all in one place on the website, in addition to, so after they've been answered on the Discord. So we'll definitely save today's chat, and we just will remove all the names to remove any identifying information. Yeah. Oh, time-wise, we're doing perfect. So we finished all the content of the workshop, and afterwards, we'll stick around a few minutes for questions, and then there's also the Discord server. Yeah. Oh, we were exactly at 1 o'clock. This is 1 o'clock in my time zone, but wow, that's just funny.
Oh yeah. Well, there's one small thing that I could add. I think people are talking about research and publication. So I think what something a lot of people get mistaken about is having publication. It is not actually about having the number of papers. It's about the content of the paper. So even if you have never written a paper before, you really don't have to worry because you usually write a paper if you have done a research project, and if you haven't done a research project or have never written a paper yet, you really don't have to worry because during masters, in most of the European universities, you do 1 year of master thesis research work, and you are usually expected to turn that 1 year of research into your paper. And one trend that I've noticed in most of the applicants is during the last 1 year of your undergraduate or something, they just try to write a lot of papers, increase the volume of papers, randomly doing something, programming a small algorithm, putting it as a paper. Just don't do it because it kind of brings down the quality of your research. You could still not have any papers but have done very good research. So don't think that the number of papers you have is an indication to your research skills.
Yeah.
And it also, if you have a paper, it also depends on which journal you are publishing it is. Like having it in on archive as a preprint is fine because sometimes it is usually peer reviewed or like by your professor or something. But yeah, it also depends on whether the journal you have actually does all those peer reviewing, and it actually, your research has weight or not.
To add on that, so for publications, actually, so in physics, journal publications are more common, and in computer science and some other engineering fields, it's that moves really quickly. Like have like just things change fast in those fields. So it's actually in recent years, it's more common for conference publications for conference papers rather than journal papers to be the kind of benchmark for the computer science field. Also, it really depends on the specific research field, as Bravita said, of how much weight it is or how common it is for a journal publication. So I think it helps, I guess, kind of connecting to this point on this slide. What points in your profile do you think were the most important in getting your application accepted? I did have a first authored physics journal publication as an undergraduate, which I heard is something that's really rare, but I don't like, and that was definitely helpful in my application. But if you don't have it, it's pretty common to not have it, and definitely not a point of concern. As I said before, even people who have never done research before can have a good shot at graduate applications. Okay, I guess I'll kind of look through the Google Meet chat, and while it's having that, each of us can answer this question that I just answered on this slide.
Yeah, and someone has asked about whether the funding or stipend you get is enough to live. Since like the funding varies in a lot of different countries, and in Europe, the amount you get per month is usually higher than what you get in US or Canada. And something that you should actually look for when you are trying to choose a country to apply is the purchasing power parity of the currency of the country. I don't want to get too technical, but then like if you want to look whether you'll have enough, you need to check which city you're living in, and you're getting, let's say UK, and you are living in a good university but on the countryside, and you are having the same amount as someone who would get at a university in London, you can easily live happily a content life, but you still won't be able to get by in London. So the city which you are going to choose also depends. And yeah, but if they are, usually they try to fix an amount that is okay to have, that is okay to live and have a reasonable quality of life, but depending on the city, you can't be sure whether it's enough to have a comfortable life, and there is a difference.
So in the US, many graduate programs have visit days, and even if they don't, you can have the chance to reach out to current graduate students at the program to see, I guess not exactly to see their living conditions, but to ask about that. So you can see just kind of, I guess you can get a sense of how they get by, like how much, like if it's fine. And so some places with extremely high cost of living in the US, it's a bit rougher to be a graduate student in that area. But for the most part, STEM graduate students are well funded in the US and Canada. So the recent protests that made national news from the University of California, Santa Cruz in the US, about graduate students not receiving enough funding to survive. That was mostly non-STEM students, and it's an issue of huge concern. But at least for research shows that STEM funding is something that's fine and should continue to be fine even throughout the pandemic. So I guess possibly graduate school might be a slightly more attractive option now than before pandemic, but that's just a theory I have.
No, I too hope that that's the case, and going forward, there are more viable opportunities for grad students to live off of the stipend and scholarship opportunities that they get, and just improve the overall quality of living. That will be nice. Another thing that I will quickly add, and this is specific to those if you're applying internationally, and I'm not sure if this also applies to like people applying domestically, but if you apply for university abroad and you plan to supplement your stipend or scholarship with an internship or a work opportunity, I recommend checking the country laws as per your visa status, and make sure that they are because some countries have certain regulations over how many hours you can work as a student.
Yeah.
So it'll be best to like take note of that and discuss that with the admissions office or maybe your supervisor or your potential employer.
Okay.
I think we're doing really good so far. Like this is really fun. What do you guys think?
Oh, we have a survey, right? Gianty's here. If she could post a survey in the Google Meet chat. So this is an anonymous survey, as I said before, but it's well, Gianty can describe it.
Yeah, that'll be nice. Thank you.
But basically, we can get feedback from y'all on how we can improve the workshop, and like what other like future, like even we'll put this recording online for anyone to access, or any future events that we're thinking about that you'd be interested in. Kind of survey your understanding of quantum computing and science and education, so we can figure out where might be common misconceptions that people might have. I guess kind of on that topic, I will say that in this kind of new field of quantum computing and quantum science, right now there is a lot of funding that even some cases where like people don't know what to do with the funding. So I will say that funding is at least, I think funding is much less of a problem as opposed to other fields of graduate study. So stay tuned. But if, for example, if you follow like Quantum Computing Report or some other like kind of business focused news on where the money in this field is going, you could see that there's a lot of funding out there and kind of a need for like, I guess some languages call it the quantum workforce, but basically there's a need for talent in this area. So funding, I think, is, although it's one of the most concerning parts, but it's also the prospects look pretty good even during pandemic for this, is what I'd say.
So someone has asked whether they should focus on the quantum chemistry and computational physics part. I could answer you because I'm specifically in that field. And I would really recommend that you actually learn whatever you can from this project that you are doing on computational physics and quantum chemistry, because this whole quantum computing thing that's gonna boom has the highest application of like first entry into the quantum chemistry. So you are actually having a head start, so make use of it. And
Yeah.
the applications they are planning to do is in quantum chemistry, because I don't know, it's just a fun story that everyone knows. The whole idea of quantum computing came from the 80s, when people wanted to simulate quantum systems and the classical computers were not enough. So they were thinking, why not use quantum mechanics to simulate quantum systems? So the quantum system that everyone wants to simulate is atoms and molecules and find out reaction rates. And even yesterday, Google published a paper on calculating the reaction. So you are actually having a head start, and yeah, keep doing it.
Yeah. Well, as Bhavitha said, like almost all experts, I would say, have this consensus that the first like large class of problems that would be accessible to being solved by quantum computers is quantum chemistry problems. So how to simulate quantum chemical systems. And actually, my undergrad research is quantum chemistry, and I didn't know any chemistry, so I didn't want to do that for graduate school. But I was working on algorithms, microwave spectroscopy algorithms, so algorithms for physical chemistry problems. So I came exactly from your background, which is like doing research in quantum chemistry and kind of computational physics, but had nothing to do with quantum computing specifically. Maybe you can make an argument indirectly that it is quantum and you use computers, but yeah, I did that transition with no problem. So I think a lot of self-learning is required to switch fields, but other than that, it's very easily doable and common to switch fields. And you can bring in your strengths from the different fields that you've experienced, and especially since research is often really interdisciplinary, it's always a good idea to just like kind of go out of your comfort zone, try out new fields, and just see what you learn. Thanks, Jayanti, for sharing the Google form. So that link right there will take you to our survey. Please fill it out if you attended. And it's anonymous, but it's short. It's just, well, that information would help us. I think we were in the middle of covering on this slide, this question right here. This is a personal question, so if you don't feel comfortable answering, you don't have to, but I guess this is the problem with this question is that it's hard to know because none of us are on the admissions committee. We have no idea what happens in there. It's kind of like a black box. It's just kind of what we think was more useful, but I guess it's still worth giving a shot at answering. Well, Alberto, and Sam,
do you want to
Oh,
take
yeah,
that first?
Yeah.
How about Alberto takes that because I haven't heard from him in quite a while.
Yeah, I was gonna say that.
Like, yeah.
Please.
So I, like Leah said, I obviously wouldn't know why my supervisor picked me. So since I was I was doing a jump from one to the other. I really didn't have previous experience in quantum computing, so I could just tell you about what I wrote in my motivation letter because probably he would have chosen, like, asked me to come for an interview only based on what you write on that. And it was like I self-learned quantum computing. I worked myself through Nielsen and Schwang and learned Qiskit by myself in like around 1 month, 1.5 months. So I mentioned him that I come from a very different background in particle physics. So I don't exactly have the academic background that you might expect someone to do a master thesis project in quantum computing right away. But like I have done all this and I will be doing a degree on that. So like I said, I mean, even for my bachelor thesis, I learned particle physics by myself because the university in which I did bachelor's didn't offer didn't do research in particle physics, so I didn't have much learning resources. So I learned everything by myself before asking my another professor from a different university to offer me a bachelor thesis project. So I guess in my case, the skill that they would have valued or something is that I was able to learn things on my own and be independent. So yeah, because like most of the time you want a new field and you want to try out means you are going to learn it by yourself to decide whether you like it or not. You can't go to a university and enroll yourself in a degree program. And yeah, so I think that was it. But because I really wouldn't know because I haven't applied to PhD programs to the other universities like Leah or something. So like maybe Samanvay could explain how he applied for his master's.
Yeah, sure. So my experience was very similar to yours. I think just being very open about our own experiences and showing that we can self-learn any research problem and dive into a completely new field and demonstrate that with past examples and show the ability to be independent, but at the same time be collaborative. I think these are some of the key things that the grad school committees would look into when reviewing one's application. So even in my case, when I wrote my statement of purpose, so this is the format that I usually follow. So I mentioned my project work and open source portfolios at the start and all the stuff that I've done as part of community building. Then I moved on specifically to the motivations about the group that I want to join, and that changes from university to university and from group to group. Uh, and why would you like to join that program, and what is it that that resonates with your own interests and work about that group, and why would you like to pursue graduate studies at that university? So I think these points would clearly help you outline your motivations to join that program, that lab at that university, and that's something that just helped me personally.
Yeah, and maybe like I remember an analogy my supervisor gave me during my bachelor thesis after I finished it. So, at least in Europe, how the research environment progresses and how you become independent in doing your own research is during bachelor thesis, you are treated like a toddler. They come,
Right.
they help you with a lot of stuff because you basically don't know anything to do. You directly go from coursework to computer or and measurement device and you start doing you don't know what. And then as you grow up to start doing your masters, you are more like a child who is like around 3 4 years old where you have your alone play times. They will leave you alone to play on your own, but then still come and check up on you. But then you go to PhD, you are like more like a person who's like 10, 11 years old. You can play whatever you want, but then every time you have a dinner at home, you are kind of like have to give your parents an update on what's going on. So yeah, that's
Great
it's
analogy.
very funny things he
Very, very
told, but
apt
I
analogy.
totally
Yeah, yeah. That's really quotable at parties, don't you think? Okay. What about you, Leah?
I think we're pretty much covered. We covered everything we wanted to cover, and also like
Yeah.
We
time
did? Oh
wise.
yeah.
Whoa, we nailed
Yeah,
it.
time we
Okay, that's good. Oh yeah, we had this slide. It's pretty vague in general. Actually, this is filler text. Ignore this. But anyway, ignore this row. But basically just showing like the approximate years since it varies a lot for across countries, and we also mentioned previously that there's a difference between like how you describe the words like in the US and Canada, like the word graduate student means master's and PhD students, and in the UK, EU, like other places in the world, it can mean that a postgraduate in India, it means that a postgraduate student is a PhD student, and then a graduate student is a master's student. So just like terminology that is different. Yeah. Um, I think like there's probably other questions that people might remember or realize like afterwards, and if that's the case, like our Discord server is just open to anyone to ask stuff or just check us out. And yeah, I guess this has been like over 2 hours. So thank you to everyone who sat through this like pretty long and very dense, I would say. Like there's a lot of information here to process. Um, but hopefully y'all learned a lot and feel a bit better about like applying to the process. Yeah. I guess I'll stop the recording now. Any last words? Uh, well, it's better without last words. I'm stopping the recording.